Teachers often ask, how can you evaluate students when they listen to stories and read different books? What do you test? A cloze test, the way I use it, helps reveal part of a learner's underlying language competence through reading. To fill in a blank successfully, learners must understand the story, connect ideas across sentences, and predict what makes sense in the context. In this sense, a cloze test measures much more than isolated vocabulary or grammar knowledge. The underlying idea comes from John Ahler's work on cloze testing as a measure of overall language proficiency rather than isolated language knowledge. This process is related to what John Ahler called grammar expectancy, the ability to use linguistic and contextual information to predict what makes sense in a text. Most teachers use cloze tests for placement. I use a much longer cloze test at several points during a program to observe student development over time. What fascinates me is that the test does more than produce a score. In that sense, it is like opening a small window into the learner's mind. I selected an interesting story at approximately the reading level that was the goal of the program. The text of the test was long enough to create a 100-item cloze test. I chose 100 items because tests with a larger number of items generally provide more reliable measurements. Since the test is used within the reading program, whose goal is to develop students to approximately the 6th grade reading level, students should eventually be able to read the entire 1,000-word plus passage fluently. The beginning of the story remained intact, so students could establish the context before encountering missing words. Approximately every 10th word was deleted. However, proper nouns and certain culturally specific terms were occasionally left intact so that performance would reflect language proficiency rather than familiarity with specific background knowledge. I used acceptable word scoring rather than exact word scoring. Native speakers completed the test to help establish acceptable responses, and students were given 60 minutes to complete the test. During test development, a retest reliability study with a separate group of junior college English majors produced a coefficient of 0.87. There are two main types of cloze tests. One is the multiple choice cloze test, which is often used to measure grammar or vocabulary. The other is the open cloze test, where students write their own answers. Open cloze tests can be scored using either exact word scoring or acceptable word scoring. I chose acceptable word scoring because it gave a more accurate picture of students' language proficiency. At the beginning of the first semester, my students typically scored around 29 out of 100. Over time, their scores increased by about 10 to 15 points per year. What interested me was not only the score gains. The answer sheets changed. Students filled more blanks and supplied increasingly appropriate responses. The cloze test helped me see progress that was not always visible in the classroom. I used the same cloze test over the 2-year program to see whether students were reaching the target reading level and whether the scores matched what they were actually reading. It also helped me guide students toward appropriate reading levels. The scores can be interpreted approximately as follows. Less than 10 means they are not yet ready for graded readers. They need to listen to stories more. The scores between 20 and 25, it means fragile readiness. They also need more story listening. Between 30 and 35, they can start reading beginning graded readers together with story listening. Around 40, it's comfortable reading at the elementary level graded readers. Around 50, intermediate graded readers and maybe upper level. Around 60, upper level graded readers and maybe they can begin readers for young adults. 60 and above, it is pleasure reader stage. They are ready for many young adult books. These score range are based on my own students. It will be interesting to see whether teachers using similar input-centered programs observe similar results. These interpretations were developed through long-term observation of my own students and should be viewed as approximate guidelines rather than fixed cut-off scores. I also collected English summaries and Japanese summaries. These allowed me to examine additional aspects of development. Written production was examined through the number of words students were able to write. Accuracy was examined through error-free clause analysis. Together, summaries and cloze tests provided a richer picture of language development than either measure alone. Language acquisition is often difficult to observe directly. Using the same cloze test over time allowed me to observe that process. The scores were useful, but the answer sheets themselves were often even more informative. For example, a student who left a blank empty on one test might later supply and eventually an. The total score might not change for the second time, but the responses suggested developing language competence. I believe this approach can help teachers observe progress in students who receive large amounts of comprehensible input through story listening and reading. For many years, acceptable word scoring was too time-consuming for widespread use. Today, automated scoring and AI may make this approach practical for many more teachers, allowing us to examine students' responses in ways that were previously impossible.